All right, say good morning. Let us begin. I want to thank our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the Shirim and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach, Zechariah ben Zechariah. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Moshe and Chavi Abramson, for dedicating Arvei Pesachim, and the Zchus of Refuah for Daniel Meir ben Chana. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, he, together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, will have a complete and enduring refuah. And with that, let us begin. Another beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Ches 108. We're going to begin in Yirus Hashem to get really into some of the halachos concerning the Seder, which are quite amazing. So we're picking up on Kuf Zayin Amud Beis 107b. 4 lines up from the bottom. Rava. So remember again, yesterday we were discussing the idea, or continuing the discussion of the Mishnah that says you're not supposed to eat samach lamincha. So we established in yesterday's daf that samach lamincha means samach lamincha kitana. So again, a half hour before mincha kitana, which again, on our perfect day, with sunrise at 6 and sunset at 6, mincha kitana being 9.5 hours into the day at 3:30 p.m., samach lamincha ultimately again will be at 3 p.m. So the Gemara says as follows. So again, we don't eat, therefore again, samach lamincha ketana. However, we saw in the end of yesterday's daf, which is that halacha lamaisa, not eating means foods which would satiate. So again, the Gemara seems to really identify that as grain-based food. But to go ahead and eat, for example, the Gemara said fruits, vegetables, meat, kishka, right, intestines. So all of that is going to be fine. So along those same lines, Rava, havashasi chamri kuli mali yom Pesach. This is interesting. Rava drank wine the entire Erev Pesach. Why? Because apparently, again, when you drink wine, wine makes you hungry. So he would drink a good amount of wine on Erev Pesach in order to go ahead and intensify his hunger. So we'll say, what's interesting about this is as follows. Ultimately, again, we see a transition. So we go now from a discussion regarding not eating things, right, in order to not become satiated, to now, again, an interesting shift over here to focusing a bit more on eating even certain things in order to go ahead and intensify one's appetite. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, by the way, from where do we know that wine increases one's appetite? So this is incredible. I just want to point out something truly beautiful that the Gemara does, an incredible hashkafa. When the Gemara says, how do you know that wine intensifies your appetite? So it was like, what a strange question, right? How do I know that wine intensifies my appetite? What's the answer? Try it, right? Try it. So you have to understand something. For the Jew, the way I know that anything is true is because it says it in the Torah. In other words, my truth, what is objectively true in this world, doesn't come from my perception. It doesn't come from what I perceive in the world to be true. It ultimately comes from Torah. It comes from Chumash. It comes from Mishnah. It comes from Gemara. It comes from Shulchan Aruch. This is incredibly powerful because remember, everything in life depends on where your truth comes from, right? If your truth comes from what you feel, or if your truth comes from what you perceive. In other words, if truth is rooted in your perception, that's a very dangerous thing, because then there's no such thing as immutable truth. That means what you feel today will govern your truth for today. And what you feel tomorrow will govern your truth tomorrow. And the isms of today will dictate this, and the isms of tomorrow will dictate that. When truth is not rooted in something objectively immalleable, then at the end of the day, truth changes. This is one of the most powerful lessons that Chazal teach us. How do I know that wine intensifies hunger? I'll tell you how. It's a brisa. It's a brisa. Because that's how the Jew knows truth. You want to know where my truth comes from? My truth comes from a brisa. My truth comes from a mishnah. My truth comes from a pasuk in Chumash. That's where MS comes from. So the Gemara goes right there. Where do I know that wine intensifies hunger? This none. I will say this is actually going to be a very interesting discussion that we're going to get to next week. Beina kosos halalu. I will say drinking between the arba kosos. This is very important halacha. Drinking wine in between the arba kosos. Can you drink additional wine? So between the cups of wine, Rabbi says we're going to see specifically, this is referring to between cups 1 and 2, and between cups 2 and 3. Again, this is going to be a sugi. You'll see its reference. Shas references it on Kuf Yud Zayin 117. So we'll get to it. But again, what's the halacha regarding drinking in between cups 1 and 2 and cups 2 and 3? So remember again, just to give us context, between cups 1 and 2 is the first part of the seder, right? Between pretty much 1 and 2. And 2 and 3 are the first part of the Seder. So, if you want to drink between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, you can. But between 2 and 3, between 3 and 4, you are not permitted to go ahead and drink. So I will say, again, that's going to get into, if you look at the Rashbam says, Bein Shlishi l'Revi lo yishta, Shlishi di Berkas Hamazon. Remember, cup number 3 is benching, is the cup for benching. Dichevan de lo chayshinan o the geruri liba, lo sharina le, dinir kamosif al arba koso. So also, this is very interesting. We're going to see that apparently drinking between 3 and 4, and of course drinking after 4, has the appearance of adding on to the 4 cups. Now, why that concern applies between 3 and 4 and after 4, not between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, we'll discuss in the Gemara. The Amrit. Now, if halacha l'maaseh, if you were to say, misad soid, that wine satiates, then amayishteh, then why are you allowed to drink extra wine between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3? Also remember again, between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 is before what? Before matzah. So if you say that wine has the ability to satiate, then why would you be allowed to drink additional wine between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3? After all, haka'achil lematzah achila gasa. Because again, if wine satiates, then you're going to end up being too full by the time you get to the matzah, and it's going to be achila gasa. Ela shmamina migrar garir. But rather, what do you see from here? You see from here that wine, in fact, intensifies one's appetite. So the fact that I'm allowed to drink more wine between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, which again I will say are the cups that take me up through Birkas Hamazon, indicates that halacha l'maaseh, the property of wine is that it intensifies one's hunger. So I will say incredible. That's how I know that wine intensifies one's hunger. Pretty incredible. Rav Sheshes, Rav Sheshes would go ahead and fast the entire Erev Pesach. So I'll say this is actually quite fascinating. So the Gemara says why. So Neima Kasava Rav Sheshes Samoch Lamincha Gidolot. So maybe Rav Sheshes held the following. Maybe Rav Sheshes held that when the Mishnah said you can't eat on Erev Pesach Samoch Lamincha means Samoch Lamincha Gidola, which Abosai means on our perfect day from 6 to 6. Samach Lamincha Gidola means when? 12 o'clock. Now watch this. Not only that, but what else did Rav Sheshes hold? Umishum pischohu dilma mimshach va'asilim nuyemele avet pischa. Well, remember again in yesterday's daf, we had 2 issues or two possibilities as to why you're not allowed to eat samach lamincha. Possibility 1, if you hold that samach lamincha means, let's work backwards. If you hold samach lamincha means mincha kitana, then why can't you eat samach lamincha? What was the reason? In order to eat matzah with proper tiyavon, with more appetite. But if you hold samach lamincha means mincha gidola, then what's the reason you can't eat samach lamincha? Out of a concern that you may become derelict in offering up the Korban Pesach. So watch this. So now we have a fact. The fact is Rav Sheshes fasted on Erev Pesach. So we're trying to figure out why that is. So the Gemara says, well, perhaps, halacha l'maisa, he held samach l'mincha meant mincha gidola, and therefore the reason you have to stop eating is lest you become derelict in offering up the Korban Pesach. Now watch this. The Gemara says, v'savarla, and maybe we'll say this is pretty wild. We've never seen this before. V'savarla, well, actually I shouldn't say that. We saw that in the last cycle of Daf Yomi. V'savarla, so we'll say maybe he held the following statement of Rabbi Oshia named Rabbi Lazar. Machshir haya ben beseira bepesach sheshachtu shachris ba'arba'asar lishmo. So we'll say, listen to this. Ben beseira holds, we'll say this is wild. Ben beseira holds that halacha l'maisa, a Korban Pesach which was offered up in the morning on Erev Pesach is kosher. Why? So the Gemara says because he holds mitzafra zman pischahu dechule yom chazi lepischa. Ben Beseira holds that halacha lemaisa, the entire day of Erev Pesach is fit for Karban Pesach sacrifice. But say a wild cheetah. Forget about chatzos. The entire day of Erev Pesach is fit to offer up the carbon. Where does he get this from? This is incredible. The savar bein ha'arbayim bein Erev de'esmo le'erev deha'idna. It will say an incredible interpretation. He held bein ha'arbayim, right? You have to offer up the Pesach bein ha'arbayim. So we'll say we normally understand bein ha'arbayim means what? In the afternoon. Ben Beseira felt bein ha'arbayim means in between the two evenings. What are the two evenings? Evening number one is the start of Erev Pesach, and evening number two is Pesach itself. You have to offer up the Karban Pesach, and obviously that doesn't include the nighttime, because that's obvious. Why is that obvious? Because Karbanos are never offered up at night. But so we'll say a really incredible, and again, I just want to point out this Gemara, this statement of Ben Beseira is not in Pesachim. The statement of Ben Beseira ultimately is quoted in Meseches Zvachim. So this is really quite an interesting opinion. So we'll say, so again, just to hold cup over here. So what the Gemara is suggesting is we have Rav Sheshes fasting on Erev Pesach. Maybe Rav Sheshes we understand the whole reason the Mishnah says you can't eat Samach LaMincha is why? Lest you be derelict in offering up the Karban Pesach. And maybe Rav Sheshes holds like Ben Beseira, who holds that halacha l'maaseh you could offer up the Karban Pesach the entire day of Erev Pesach. If that's the case, then it's possible Rav Sheshes held you can't eat all of Erev Pesach lest you go ahead and forget to offer up the Karban itself. To which the Gemara says, no. Amri lo, no, actually that's not the reason. Shai Rav Sheshes was different. Why did Rav Sheshes fast? The istinis hava. He was fastidious, right? He was very sensitive. A mifunak, the time bitzafra midi, the time bitzafra midi, la arta lo have mahani lemichle. Well, it says Rav Sheshes was very sensitive, and I guess had a very small appetite. And if he would eat something in the morning, he would not be hungry in the evening. Therefore, again, he fasted on Erev Pesach in order to be able to eat the matzah b'tei avon with a proper appetite. Nothing to do with the position of Ben Beseira, which is also quite a fascinating idea. How sometimes, you see someone do something, and we often ascribe intentions to people's actions without really having any level of understanding. So isn't it incredible? So Ben Beseira is fasting, and look at the initial assumption the Gemara makes. He's fasting because Samach Mincha means Mincha Gidola. But he holds like Ben Beseira, ultimately again, that you could offer up the Karban Pesach the entire Pesach. And therefore, again, you can't eat lest you be judged from the Karban Pesach, and therefore he doesn't eat the whole day. To which the Gemara says, no, he actually had just a very small appetite. That's all. It was just a very small appetite. If he ate a little bit in the morning, you wouldn't eat in the evening, so he fasted the whole day. It was an incredible musar, how we have to be so careful to reserve judgment on things, because often we see a circumstance, we see a situation, we see a person do something, and halacha l'maisa, we assume we've got it all sized up. I've got this all figured out, when in fact we don't. And often we can be terribly wrong about people, terribly wrong about circumstances, with terrible repercussions as well. How much we have to reserve judgment until we have all the necessary information. Even then, better not to judge, but at least wait till you have all the information. Good about says the Mishnah went weiter. Even an ani, a pauper, should not eat the seder, should not eat Karban Pesach, should not go ahead and eat matzah until he reclines. Shabbos say this actually is very important. We're gonna speak a little bit about Heseba now. So understand that the point of Heseba is the point of reclining is to be a physical form, an objective physical demonstration of Cheirus, of freedom. So meaning on Pesach, not only is the mandate of Chayev Adam Liros is Atzvok Yotzim, not only is the mandate to see myself physically free, but the mandate is to demonstrate that freedom in an objectively visible fashion as well. So the act of reclining is the way in which I physically demonstrate that sense of Cheirus. The Gemara's novelty is that even the ani has to go ahead and recline, which of course tells me that what? That the Cheirus of Pesach is not a manifestation of my personalistic circumstances, but rather again the Cheirus of the night of the Seder is an objective demonstration of my inherent freedom, almost independent and divorced from my personal circumstances. So Itmar, so let's analyze. This is really incredible. Itmar, matzah tzarech haseba, marach in tzarech haseba. So the Gemara says you have to recline when eating matzah, but you don't recline when eating maror. So we'll say, look at the Rashbam, matzah tzricha haseba, kisha ochel matzah shal mitzvah, laila rishon ki b'nei chorin shu zecher legeula. So we'll say this goes back already to the beginning of the parak when we spoke about the interesting concept of matzah, right? Is matzah ultimately, again, the bread of affliction, halach ma'anya, or is matzah the bread of freedom? So here the Rashbam says that ultimately, again, what the Gemara says, when we eat matzah, we recline, because ultimately, again, it's zecher legeula. Zecher legeula, the consumption of matzah is to remember the fact that we were redeemed. This is going to be incredibly important as we go weiter. So therefore, I recline when I eat matzah, but I don't recline when I eat maror. Why not? Rashbam says, because maror is zecher la'avdos. Ultimately, again, is to remember the slavery. So we'll say it's a very important paradigm in the Seder. So pretty much what the Gemara is setting up is, anything you do or anything you consume over the course of the Seder that is zecher lecheirus requires heseba, requires reclining. Anything you do in the course of the Seder, ultimately, again, that is zecher la'avdos, ultimately, again, you don't consume reclining. Yain, what about wine? Se'itmar b'shei Rav Nachman tzarech haseba. Ve'itmar b'shei Rav Nachman in tzarech haseba. So we'll say very interesting when it comes to wine. So we have two conflicting versions of what Rav Nachman said. One version said that according to Rav Nachman said it requires reclining. And the other opinion of Nachman said it doesn't require reclining, v'lo pligi. And the truth is they're not contradicting each other. Watch this. Ha b'tarti kasi kamoi, ha b'tarti kasi basuroi. They're referring to the two different cups, right? One is a statement regarding the first two cups. One is a statement referring to the second two cups. Now, both say that's fine, except the only problem is what? Which one is which? Right? Which one is which? So, okay, so very nice. And now I know two cups require reclining, two cups don't require reclining. So which two require, which two don't require? So this is incredible. Amri la lahaygisa, va'amri la lahaygisa. So we'll say, now there's a machlokes on which two require reclining and which two don't require reclining. Watch this. Amri la lahaygisa. So the one opinion says, Trei kasi kamoi bo heseba, dahashtohu de kamaschala lacheirus. The first opinion says it's the first two cups of wine which require heseba. Why are both saying? Because over the first two cups of wine is when the narrative of freedom unfolds. Remember again, the first cup of wine is Kiddush, the second cup of wine is Magid. That's the whole story of our emancipation from inside. Also remember again, the bracha that we recite, we're going to see this inside, but the bracha that we recite over that cup is the second bracha. The second cup is Asher Ga'alanu. We recite the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed us. So therefore, the first opinion says the first two cups ultimately again go ahead and reflect our Cheirus, our newfound freedom, and therefore they get Heseba. However, both say this is incredible. Trei kasi basrai lo ba Heseba. But the second two cups don't require a seba. Listen to this, this is great. The Gemara says, because my dahava hava, what happens. Or as the say, this is great. Now, what does this mean? Right? By the time we get to the second two cups, so our redemption from Mitzrayim, old news. My dahava hava. Now the truth is, remember, the Seder shifts, right? The Seder has two parts. The first part of the Seder is focused on Yetzias Mitzrayim. The second part of the Seder is focused on Messianic redemption, right? So what the Gemara says is the concept of Cheirus. The concept of Cheirus ultimately, again, is focused on the first two cups, which focus on Yetzias Mitzrayim. The second two cups, which focus more on Messianic redemption, future redemption. So again, there's no reclining there. The way the Gemara phrases it is, "My dahava hava." We spoke about Yetzias Mitzrayim. We spoke about Cheirus. We're done with that. Therefore, no reclining by the second. Now, look, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashbam, sorry. So the Rashbam says, "Dahu ashtam mishtay b'cheirus ubegeula shu omer haggadah hasha shamina min." Actually, we'll say so. Before we get, actually, take a look at Tosas. Take a look at Tosas. My dahava hava. So Tosas says, "Shekvar amru geula lifnei asuda v'af agav dematzah tzricha seba v'lo amrin my dahava hava shiny matzah she ikar suda yosra miyayin v'od biyayin hasef kvar b'shnei kosos harishonim." So we'll say this is very interesting. So Tosas just points out, why don't we say the same thing by matzah? Because think about this just a moment. When do you eat matzah? When do you eat matzah? Technically, after Magid. Right? Remember again, I'm not going to sing for you the Simani HaSeder, but you understand that again, Motzi Matzah comes after Magid. So what? So we'll say the Gemara is now suggesting you only have to go ahead and recline for the first 2 cups, not for the second 2 cups, because the first 2 are speaking about Geulas, the time of the redemption from Egypt, and once you get to the second 2 cups, Ma'ida Hava Hava, the Egyptian narrative or the Geula narrative is in the past. So why don't you say the same thing by Matzah? So Tosas gives 2 answers. He says ultimately again, Matzah is different because matzah is the entire ikar of the Seder. Everything is about matzah. Therefore, even though technically speaking, matzah is being consumed after Magid is finished, nevertheless, matzah still requires a seba. Va'od sheksuva b'Torah zecher lecheirus shelo hispik b'tseikam lahachmitz ad shenigalu. So we'll say this is incredible Tosas. Furthermore, again, Tosas says that matzah itself is the bread of geula. It is the bread of redemption. Why is it the bread of redemption? Because again, it represents the idea that we left Egypt with such haste that the dough didn't have time to rise. Va'afal gav dahavya lechem oni yesh la ochla derech Cheirus. Both say this is an incredible formulation which we're going to come back to. Tosa says matzah is lechem oni, which is consumed derech Cheirus. They both say what a profound formulation. Matzah is the bread of affliction, which is consumed as a free man. The bread of affliction, which is consumed in the manner of emancipation. It's an incredible formulation because we're often so consumed by this machlokes in the identity, or this duality in the identity of matzah, right? What is matzah? The Ramban brings down that they ate matzah when they were slaves. We ate matzah for 210 years. Why did we eat matzah? Because Ramban says, you know what the great part of matzah is? The great part of matzah is, well, from a master's perspective, is it's cheap. I don't mean I'm Shmura matzah, right? It's cheap, it's filling, and it sits in your system for prolonged periods of time, as we know well, right? So therefore, again, it's the most incredible food for a slave population. Tosa says matzah is lechem oni. There's no question about it. The fact that we ate matzah again when we left Egypt, we'll say, here's something amazing. The fact that we left matzah when we left Egypt, that was quote unquote, I'm going to use this word, although you know it's not true, that was an accident. That was that was just a circumstance which arose because of the expedited pace of redemption. But ultimately, again, that was just because he left the bread didn't have time. That we would have rather had challah. We ate matzah for 210 years. So Tosa says, so what's the difference between the matzah we ate when we left Egypt and the matzah we ate ultimately in Egypt for 210 years? Here's the difference. The matzah in Egypt was lechem oni, eaten, consumed b'derech oni. The matzah of Pesach was lechem oni, consumed derech Cheirus. Both say such a profound distinction. It could be the same bread. It's the same lechem oni. But for 210 years it was consumed derech oni, and then when we left Mitzrayim it was consumed derech Cheirus. So therefore both say, coming back over here, this is not matzah. We're going to get to this later. It's a very, very exciting tosis. They'll say these little pieces are so necessary to help formulate our hashkafic understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish over the course of the Seder. In any event, back to the Gemara. So the Gemara said now 4 cups. According to this approach, 2 that we recline for, 2 that we don't recline for. First 2, according to this first approach, we recline for the first 2 because the first 2 is when we discuss the redemption from Egypt. The second 2, the Gemara says, "My dahava hava." What's done is done. But it also tells you an incredible lesson. What's the incredible lesson? That you have to make sure in life not to just simply rely or to reflect on your accomplishments of the past. So it's good to go ahead and relive the accomplishments of the past, and then you have to move on and accomplish something new. Ma'ida hava hava. In other words, we don't spend the entire night focusing on Yitzias Mitzrayim, which is pretty incredible, but rather, again, we spend the first 2 kosos on Yitzias Mitzrayim, second 2 kosos on Gulas Mashiach. Gulas Mitzrayim was great. What's next? What's next? How do we bring the next geula? There are people, again, who accomplish great things and spend the rest of their lives reflecting on those accomplishments. That's not the way the Jew lives. Accomplish great things, yes, reflect on your accomplishments, then you say the statement, my dahava hava, that was the past. Now my job is to put my kohos into building a beautiful future. An incredible yisod. Others have a different interpretation. Adirabba, trei kasi basrai ba eseba, hahi shaita de kahav Cheirus. We'll say second opinion says no, you don't recline for the first 2, you do recline for the second 2. Why? Because the first 2, the truth is, are very much focused on what? Reliving the servitude. So when you drink wine over the first part of the Seder, you don't recline because avodim hayinu, right? Avodim hayinu, that is the essence of the first part of the Seder. You do recline for the second 2 cups because, again, although they're focused on messianic redemption, there is no discussion regarding the servitude. The Gemara, so we'll say, which one is this? So what do we recline for? This is great. So the Gemara says, Hashta de itmar hachi ve'itmar hachi, idi ve'idi ba'aseba. To which the Gemara says, you're right, but now that we're focusing on this idea, now that there are difference of opinions, halach l'mais will say, what do? We recline for all 4 cups. And I will say that indeed is halacha l'maisa. We do a seva for all 4 cups. I just want to point out something very interesting, that you see that we do a seva for all 4 cups, not because anyone is suggesting that all 4 cups actually require a seva. This is very interesting. But rather why? Because halacha l'maisa, there's a machlokes. And just in order to, and again, by the way, it's a pretty solid machlokes. The svaras work very beautifully on both sides. The svaras for the first 2, the svaras for the last 2. So the Gemara says, not have a machlokes, we just recline for all 4 cups. Pretty incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. We'll say, so the Gemara goes right to prakton. Now let's speak a little bit about the mechanics of heseba. So prakton, lo shma heseba. We'll say, what's prakton? If you take a look at the first wide line of the Rashbam, panav klapi malav shochev alachora. So we'll say, this is extreme heseba. Laying down on your back, right? Let's say again, you bring the couch over to the table, you lay down on your back. The Gemara says that's not called heseba. That's not called heseba. So the Gemara says, now again, similarly again, heseba, similar shma heseba, leaning on your right side is also not called heseba. So heseba means only leaning to the left, not laying on your back, not laying on your right side. Furthermore, we'll say leaning to your right poses a choking hazard. So does leaning on your back, right? So again, the Rashbam points this out as well. So we'll say, so bottom line is, heseba is a very specific type of leaning. It's a leaning to the left, which ultimately, again, for us during the Seder, it's often a very awkward way to eat and to drink, but clearly, again, Bismana Gemara, that was demonstrative of the way that quote-unquote free people or upper echelon of society would often eat. But again, therefore, anything that doesn't resemble that, laying on your back, leaning to the right, is not called heseba. Isha itzel baila, supposing that's some interesting cases. What about a wife by her husband? Lo by heseba. A wife in front of her husband does not have to do heseba. Now, why not? Take a look at the Rashbam. Isha in heseba, 4 lines up from the bottom, says the Rashbam. Mipnei emas baila, because of the reverence, right? Ema means fear, but it really means the reverence she has for her husband. Ukifufalo, and literally, she's subservient. I'm not stating an opinion. I'm just quoting a Rashbam. I just want to be clear. Ukifufalo, umefar shildos zavachai, lav dar chayu dinashi lemizga. So both say, now I want to just give you kind of the background to this Gemara. So the background to this Gemara is as follows. We just established that there's a din of heseba. What we begin to see, what the Gemara is not going to highlight, is if you're having the Seder with someone who you have yira, for who you revere, right? Whether because you just revere them because of the nature of the relationship, or you revere them because halachically there's an obligation to do so, you don't do heseba in front of that person. Because the act of doing heseba in front of that person would be a slight to the kavod of that individual. So the Gemara says, for example, a wife doesn't do heseba in front of her husband. However, them isha chashuvahi, if she's an important woman. Now, what does it mean if she's an important woman? In other words, if she's a woman of her own standing, independent of her husband, ultimately again tzricha seba. Then she does require seba. So we'll say again, the post can bring down that bizman hazeh, all nashim are nashim chashuvos, right? Women have the status of important. Women have identities of their own, and therefore, again, a woman does do heseba. Woman does do heseba. Now, again, we'll discuss another opinion when it comes to heseba in just a moment. Bein eitzav. So we'll say, I just want to point out, we'll see this. We'll see this in a little bit later if we get to it today or maybe tomorrow, which is the opinion of the Rav Yah. We're going to see the Rav Yah holds that bisman hazeh there is no din of heseba. The reason is there's no din of heseba is why. We'll say a very simple reason why. No one eats that way. So Rav Yah says, we're making people do something physically uncomfortable and to be demonstrative of freedom when no one eats that way. When the Gemara mandates a din of heseba, the Gemara was mandating it because halacha l'maisa, that was how three people ate. So we don't really accept this opinion of the Rav Yah because at the end of the day, the Gemara says we do a seba, so we do a seba. Interesting enough, the Rav Yah says the Rama says that nashim, women, were somchos on the Rav Yah, which is even today you'll find that many women don't do heseba by the seder, not because they're kafufos leba'alehen, and not because they're subservient to their husbands, but because somehow over the generations the minhag evolved that women don't do heseba. Of course, a woman can do heseba, 100%. But again, if it happens to be the minhag in your family or the practice in your family that women don't do heseba, just know that that's based on the opinion of the Rav Yah. Again, we'll see it inside. So the Gemara says, "Bein eitzel aviv." What about a son by his father? A son by his father, by a seba, requires a seba. So the Gemara says, "Ibailu." If you take a look at Rashi says, "Bein eitzel." I'm sorry, the Rashbam. Rashbam says, "Bein eitzel aviv tzarech seba to lo havi kafuf kol kach." So we'll say this is very interesting because a son is not really subservient to his father. As much as a son has an obligation of kavod and yira, ultimately, again, there's not that level of subservience. Therefore, a son will go ahead and do heseba. We'll say there's a lot of lumdis in these sugyas as well, which we don't have time to get into, but maybe we'll find an opportunity. Talmud eitzel rabomai. What about a Talmud by his Rebbe? Let's say you're having Pesach Seder with your Rebbe. So what's talacha? Does a Talmud do a Seder in front of his Rebbe? So Tashma, Amar Abaye, Ki Avinon Beimar, when we were in the house of Mar, our Rebbe, Zaginon Abirche Dahadadi. Ultimately, again, we would lean against the knees of one another. So we'll say the way they would do a Seder, the Talmidim, is everybody would lean against their fellow. Ki Asinu Labe Rabbi Yosef, when we came to the house of Rabbi Yosef, Amar Lani said to us, Lo tzrichisu, you do not have to do a Seder. Why? Because the reverence you have for your Rebbe is like the reverence you should have for the Ribono Shel Olam. Therefore, Rabbi Yosef was telling them, a Talmud does not do heseba in front of his Rebbe, because it also makes sense. Heseba is a more relaxed posture, so you cannot assume that posture in a place where you have to have enhanced reverence. The Brisa says a person does heseba, even a Talmud, in front of his Rebbe. So we'll say here, so it sounds like what we said before based on Rabbi Yosef, that a Talmud would not do heseba in front of a Rebbe. Here the Brisa says that a Talmud does do heseba in front of his Rebbe. We'll say it's great. When the Brisa says over here that a Talmud does heseba in front of his Rebbe, what type of Talmud and Rebbe are we talking about? A carpenter's or a blacksmith's apprentice. So we'll say people have different type of Rebbeim. I have a Rebbe who teaches me Torah, and I have a Rebbe who teaches me Parnasa. Both are important Rebbeim. When we said before that halacha l'maisa, you don't do a seba in front of a Rebbe, that's the Rebbe who teaches you Torah. When the Brisa says you do heseba in front of a Rebbe, that's the Rebbe who teaches you your trade, teaches you your Parnasa. What about a shamish? Right? So what about a waiter? Right? The servant. So let's say the guy is serving the meal. Jewish shamish, so he's going ahead and serving. Does the shamish do heseba? So Tashma, Damar B'Shimon Levi, Hashamish sha'achal kizayis matzah kishu mesav yatsa. If the shamish eats a kizayis of matzah when he's reclining, he's yotze mesav in, lo mesav lo shmamina. Ultimately, again, what do you see from here? You see that the shamish has to go ahead and do a seba, shmamina, by a seba, shmamina. Even a shamish will say. Now, again, the truth is, it's not really a surprise. The reason the Gemara is asking is, what happens if there's someone on the Seder night who is functioning in the capacity of a servant? which is an interesting place to be on Seder nights. Here, I'm a Jewish waiter. I'm a Jewish servant. So do I do Heseba or not? Shabbos, what's interesting about this is the following. You'll say, isn't it Pashet? If the Ani is doing Heseba, then certainly again, the Shamish is doing Heseba, right? Again, Shabbos said there's a big difference because the Ani could sit at the table and Halacha Lamai said there's nothing behaviorally that's happening that makes him look like a servant. The Shamish is actively running around on the Seder night serving everyone else. So perhaps for Heseba purposes, the Shamish is even more compromised than the Ani. Kamash Mola, no. Kamash Mola, that again, Abosai, the concept of physically expressing Cheirus on the Seder night is fundamentally divorced from your individual circumstances. That Allah Lamaisa, everyone is chayiv in Heseba, no matter what your personal circumstances are. The only exception to the Heseba rule is if you're having Seder with someone whom you're obligated to revere, right? Who you have a concept of reverence towards, then the act of assuming such a relaxed posture in the presence of that person will be inappropriate. Good. Rabbi Shimon Levi. Nashim chayavos ba'arba kosos halalu. Women are obligated in Dalit Kosos. Why? Amud Beis. Sha'af hin hayu ba'osane. So we'll say this is great. Because ultimately, again, women were also included in the miracle of Yitzias Mitzrayim. So because, again, the 4 cups are an expression of gratitude for the miracle of deliverance, so too women are obligated as well. Now take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Rashbam writes, Shafin Ibos Anis Tarmidim Sech Sota Bishar Noshim Tzedkanios Shayba Osadar Nigalu V'chein Gabi Mikra Megillah Arminan Hachim Mishum Da'ali De Esther Hava V'chein Gabi Chanukah Mesech Shabbos Lashon Morena Alevi. So we'll say the Rashbam points out something very interesting. So we'll say the lashon of Afhin Hayu Ba'osanes, it sounds like they were also part of the miracle. The Rashbam says no. What it means is that the miracle of Yitzias Mitzrayim occurred because of women. He quotes over here ultimately the Gemara Masechah Sota that goes through the entire narrative explaining how essentially the men had given up on the possibility of redemption. The men had given up, and it was the women ultimately again who kept the dream and the desire for redemption alive. So the Rashbam says, Afinei ba'osanes doesn't simply mean they were included in the miracle, but rather it means they played a dominant role in the miracle. And the Rashbam says the same idea that we find by Purim. The Gemara says, why women are chayavos and mikra megillah? Why? Sha'af hina yu ba'osanes. They were included in the miracle. Now, of course, by Purim, it's not, to say that women were included in the miracle of Osai is selling their role a bit short, right? A woman was the architect of the miracle of Purim. If you take a look at Tosas, so Tosa says over Hayu ba'osahanes, second Tosa ba'osahanes, Rashbam, Perush Rashbam, Sha'al Yodam Nigalu, V'chein Megillah de Esra B'chanukah de Yehudis, V'kasha Da'af Mashma She'inan Be'ikar. So we'll say the Rashbam. So Tosa sees Rashbam's explanation, and he says just the only problem with that is Af Hin Hayu ba'osahanes again indicates a lashon of like being included, but not necessarily a lashon of primacy. So yes, they were also included, but lav dafka, they were primary characters. Va'odi Rishami Garis, Sha'af Hein Hayu Ba'osahane, Safek Mashma Ba'osa Sakarnad Lahashma Laraglabet. Okay, so Tosa just points out over here, he says, Aval Ba'arba Kosos, Dirabanan Takidu Gamlunoshin, Kevin Shabosane. So let's say fine, just pointing out over here that there's some, we don't have time for it now, but there's some interesting discussion regarding the definition of this phrase, Afhin Hayu Ba'osanes. Doesn't mean they were also included, or doesn't mean that they played a primary role. In any event, women are going to be obligated in Dalet Kosos. Am Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Arba Kosos Halalu, Sarach Shiyehei Bohan Kedei Mezigas Kosyav. So we'll say some halachas regarding Dalet Kosos. Number 1, they have to have proper dilution ratio. So we'll say, so just so you know, from the Gemara's perspective, the proper dilution ratio was 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Right? You had wine concentrate, 3 parts water to 1 part wine. So you have to have proper dilution ratio. Listen to this. What happens if you drank undiluted wine? What happens then? What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Yatsa, you are Yotze. Now again, we'll discuss exactly what it is that you are Yotze, but halacha l'maaseh you're Yotze. Fine. Shtan b'asachas. But this is interesting. What happens if you drank the 4 cups at once? Yatsa. Your Yotze. Again, we'll discuss exactly what this means. It's interesting. The Rashbam says, if you look at Bavas Achos, the Rashbam says, Ira arba'asan besoch kos echad. So the Rashbam says, what does it mean you drank them all at once? You poured all 4 cups into 1 cup. You made yourself like a Seder big gulp, right? So you went ahead and you poured everything into one. So the Rashbam says, Yotze, your Yotze. The Rashbam then goes on and explains, quotes Rabbeinu Shlomo, who says that he says that's the Perush of Rabbeinu Shlomo. The Rashbam says that doesn't make any sense because it will say pouring 4 cups into 1 cup and drinking that cup is equivalent to what? Drinking 1 cup, which is a very big cup. Therefore, the Rashbam says Babas Achos means you drank all 4 cups consecutively, as opposed to drinking the 4 cups as arranged over the course of the Seder, you drank all 4 cups at once. So again, Yatza. Hishka mehen labanav nebeso. Yatza, if you give to drink to the members of your family, you're Yotze. Okay, so we'll say, let's analyze this. Now we're going to go through this brisa one by one. Shtan chai. So the first thing the Gemara mentioned was you drank undiluted wine. So the brisa says you're Yotze. Now what does that mean? Amar Rava, Yidei yayin yatza, Yidei Cheirus lo yatza. So Rava says, what does it mean that you're Yotze? Yidei yayin. You're Yotze the fact that you drank 4 cups of wine. However, you are not Yotze Yidei Cheirus. The Rashbam says Yidei Cheirus lo yatza, kilomar, Ein zu mitzvah shlema she'ein chashivus ela b'yayin mazik. So we'll say, I just want to point out something very interesting over here, because Rav is saying something dramatically amazing. That in the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos, there are essentially 2 mitzvos. There's yayin and there's cheirus. Yayin means the concept of drinking 4 cups. Cheirus means allowing those 4 cups to be a demonstration of your personalistic freedom. And interestingly enough, Rava says that you could actually divide those 2. So for example, if you drink 4 cups of undiluted wine, have you fulfilled the mitzvah of Dalet Kosos? The answer is yes. But have you allowed those kosos to be demonstrative of your freedom? And the answer is no. So we'll say I just want to point out this is an incredible chiddush, of which there is an incredible amount of discussion, because it's not clear exactly how Rava is able to make that distinction. Now, the truth is, we'll say there is a good reason for it. We'll discuss in just a bit. All right, I probably should say it now, except that we don't have time. All right, I'm going to save it. This goes back, just remind me this tomorrow, Shir. This goes back, Rabosai, to why it is that we drink Dalet Kosos. Why do we drink Dalet Kosos? So we're going to see that there is a fundamental machlokes as to what the nature or the source of the 4 cups of Pesach are. So right now, let's absorb the information, and then we'll go back and try to plug it in. Next, Shtan Ravas Achos, when you drink 4 cups at once, so Rava Amar Yidei Yayin Yatza, Yidei Arba Kosos Lo Yatza. So we'll say, so once again, Rav comes along, Rav over here says, Your Yotze Yidei Yayin, and we'll say here, Yayin means something different. Yayin in this context, according to Rav, means Simchas Yamtiv. Simchas Yamtiv. If you go out and you drink 4 cups consecutively, you fulfilled the mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? V'samachta b'chagecha, to rejoice on Yamtiv. But you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of Dalet Kosos. I will say, what do you see from here? Why not? Ultimately, again, because the mitzvah of Dalet Kosos is not simply the consumption of 4 cups of wine, but rather the mitzvah of Dalet Kosos is what? The consumption of 4 cups of wine throughout the Seder. So we'll say you're beginning to see a number of very interesting ideas. That first of all, again, number one, by Dalet Kosos, there's a concept of Dalet Kosos, and there's a mitzvah, and there's a concept of Cheirus. There's a mitzvah of Yayin and a mitzvah of Cheirus. Very interesting. Next, the mitzvah of Dalet Kosos is really only fulfilled when one drinks 4 cups strategically placed at 4 different intervals at the Seder. But if you go and you drink them all at once, your Yotzei de Yayin, which according to Rav means Simchas Yamtiv, but ultimately again not Yotzei, the din of Arba Kosos. So if you give of the wine to drink to your children, to the members of your household, Yotza, your Yotzei, that's true. In other words, if you want to go ahead and share the remnants of your cup with the members of your family, you absolutely have the right to do so. But halacha l'maisa, you must drink rov kos. Also, this is incredibly important. This goes back, we saw this again already, by Kiddush Makom Suda as well. The individual making the bracha must go ahead and drink rov kos. Meisvei, is going to raise the kasha, dalet kosos, halal utar she'eban kedei revi'es echad. So this is very interesting. The Gemara says that Dalet Kosos that we discussed have to have a revius. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Sarach shei bahen kedei revius echad. Echad chai ve'echad mazug, echad chadash ve'echad yashan. So we'll say it has to have a revius, whether again it's undiluted, whether it's diluted, whether it's new wine, whether it's old wine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Sarach shei bo tam umare yayin. Rabbi Yehuda says it must have the taste and the appearance of wine. So now you say katani mihas kadei revius. So now the Brisa said it has to have at least a revius. Va'at amrit kos yafe. And you said before that it has to be a kos yafe. So it sounds like a contradiction, to which the Gemara says it's not a contradiction. Amri idi v'idi chad shi'urhu. In fact, it's one shear. So so for example, if you were to take a quarter of a lug of wine concentrate, if you then dilute that, divide that by 4, dilute that in a dilution ratio of 3:1, 3 parts water, 1 part wine concentrate, that's what the Gemara calls a shear yafa or a kos yafa. Most of the Gemara says, my kedei miziga is kos yafa, the kamar l'chol chad v'chad, the havile kula revius. And we'll say ultimately again, what do we call mezigas kos yafa? What do we call proper dilution? That ultimately again gives everybody a proper cup of wine, a revius. You take a quarter lug of wine concentrate, ultimately again dilute it in 3 parts water to 1 part wine concentrate, and that gives you a good cup of wine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Sarach shehebo tam umare. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not just enough for wine to taste like wine, but ultimately, in order for it to be wine, it must have tam, the taste of wine, and mare, the appearance of wine. Incredibly important. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi, my time is Rabbi Yehuda. We'll say once again, where does Rabbi Yehuda get this from? Dichsev altere yayin ki yis adam. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, literally, altere yayin ki yis adam, the pasuk clearly references the idea that wine is red. So we'll say, just want to point out over here, if you take a look at Tosafos, just one important halacha. So again, the Gemara gives us a lot of the halachos of the Arba Kosos, but one of the interesting things the Gemara said is that halacha l'maisa, dilution ratios, 3 parts water to 1 part wine concentrate, and also the idea that the shear for a cup of wine is a revius. Now Tosafos points out over here, see Tosafos Ruba de Casa, Hainu kimali lugmav, kedeperish leil, umir lachatchila, tzarech lishtos revius. So we'll say we're going to have to stop over here for today. One of the interesting discussions that we are going to get into is how much of the kos do you have to drink. So we're going to see is essentially we're going to see 3 different shiurim. Shiur number 1 is at least amali lugmav, at least a cheekful. Shiur number 2 is going to be a rove revius, the majority of a revius. Shiur number 3 is going to be an entire revius. And shiur number 4, which is really the most lechatchila thing to do, is the entire cup. So again, we'll get into that in Meretz Hashem as we go a little bit weiter, but at least now we begin to see the halachic and conceptual framework of Dalet Kosos. Oseh Shkoyach.